Uh-oh.
We're very excited for another session in our series, World Religions and Ethics. And so I'm going to let Dr. Paige Rawson, who I might call Paige quite often.
That is my name, yeah.
And kind of set the tone for, we're doing something really interesting today. So we're
absolutely. Well, we're super, I mean, I'm extremely honored and excited to introduce our very own Dr. Jim Hastings. Today, we're going to be talking about Jainism. And so, sort of to introduce us a little bit to Dr. Hastings and his interest in Jainism, would you mind telling us just a little bit about yourself and what got you into the study of Jainism? Welcome.
You want the long version or the short version?
Ooh. Oh, how about the middle way?
Middle version.
Right somewhere in between.
I have to say, how far back do I want to go? I grew up on the Oregon coast after the second grade, and I was raised as a Catholic, and I was an altar boy. But sometimes at night, starting in middle school through high school, at night I would tune into KGO radio from San Francisco, and I seem to remember that I would listen a lot to Alan Watts, who was an English philosopher who was very conversant with Taoism and Buddhism and other religions, who lived in the Bay Area and would give these extensive talks. So I kind of got aware of something called Buddhism. And I think probably I started reading like Jack Kerouac, things like Dharma Bums. So one day we were in a Catholic youth organization, and the priest was there, and he says, "Does anyone have any questions?" And I said, "Yeah, I've been reading about this guy Buddha, and I've been reading about like Socrates and so on. And what confuses me is Catholic doctrine says that they won't go to heaven because they didn't know Jesus. That's not their fault. I don't know if you know Catholic doctrine. Catholic doctrine says they go to limbo. And the priest looked at me and said, "You know, good Catholics don't ask questions like that."
Yeah.
And I decided maybe I'm not a good Catholic. So anyway, I went on. I went to college. I went to a liberal arts college in Portland, Oregon, that had a very classical educational system. That is, the first semester, freshman year, everything was about Greece. We studied Greek history, Greek math, Greek philosophy, Greek art, Greek drama, Greek traditions, and so on. Next year was, or the next semester was Rome. And then it was the Renaissance. So as far as their curriculum was concerned, nothing important happened in history east of Greece.
Mm-hmm.
So I began to, kind of read on the side and kind of try and educate myself. This was the 60s, and there were various Indian gurus coming through, and so on and so on. Long story short, I went to India a couple of years after I graduated from college, and fell in love with it. And but I came back, did other things in life. I worked as a private investigator in San Francisco for a number of years. I became a professional chef and worked in the Napa Valley and Sonoma Valley. But then, really, a while ago, 1987 to be exact, a friend and I went to India, and I'd been there a couple of times by then. And we decided we wanted to go around to places of pilgrimage. Mm. And so we spent about 3 weeks traveling to Rishikesh, a place of Hindu pilgrimage, Varanasi, a place of Hindu pilgrimage, Bodh Gaya and Sarnath, places of Buddhist pilgrimage, Ajmer, place of Muslim pilgrimage. And I came back from that thinking, maybe I don't want to be cooking all my life. Maybe I want to do something else. And so I started taking classes at the nearby university, Sonoma State University. And then kind of went through all of their courses on India, began studying Hindi language there, and then started commuting to Berkeley and taking some courses there. And ultimately ended up moving to Wisconsin, going to the University of Wisconsin, and got a master's degree in South Asian Studies. And then thought, well, what do I do now? I guess Ph.D. So I stayed in that department. Ultimately, I got a Ph.D. in actually the subject matter is religions of South Asia. So while there, I was basically trained in the study of Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, Islam, and Jainism. But mostly, my focus was on Hinduism. I ended up, my wife and I, Susan, spent a year in Varanasi studying advanced Hindi there. And while we were there, we traveled to Bodh Gaya and Sarnath a couple of times. Had some very enlightening experiences there. And then I spent a year living in Rajasthan, in Jaipur, where I was doing a dissertation on a monastic community that was founded in the 16th century, arguably Hindu monastic community. So in terms of Buddhism, I had studied at University of Wisconsin. We had two main Buddhist teachers, Minoru Kyoto, who was taught primarily Japanese Buddhism, and Geshe Sopa, a Tibetan Lama who had been the tutor of the Dalai Lama when the Dalai Lama was a teenager, who taught Tibetan Buddhism. And so formed a kind of relationship with Geshe Sopa. Susan had a much closer relationship with him. So in terms of Jainism, I knew something about Jainism, but in 2006, now what's that, 14 years ago, I found out about something called the International Summer School for Jain Studies. And what it was is there are about 150,000 Jains living in the United States, about another 10, 12,000 in Canada. Most of them are well-educated, are wealthy, and don't think that Americans know enough about Jainism. And so they were offering an opportunity to go spend 10 weeks in India learning about Jainism. So I took advantage of that. We studied Jain texts and Jain philosophy and Jain this, Jain that. But the important part was we met political leaders who were Jains, economic leaders who were Jains, Jain families, Jain monks, Jain nuns, and ended up towards the end at a Jain pilgrimage place in southern India called Shravanabelagola, where there's a 10th century giant statue of this Jain saint. I spent about 10 days there, and I was really fascinated because there was this kind of daily rituals that I noticed where musicians would go out in procession carrying these images of various jinas through the streets. And so I went back in 2010, spent 10 weeks there, just staying in the monastery, talking with the abbot of the monastery quite a bit, talking with monks. This was the sort of the rainy season in India. That's when the monks settle down and start to give teachings and so on. And so that's really where I learned quite a bit about Jainism, in addition to kind of reading and so on. I've had some, very insider experiences, I guess I would say. For instance, when we went to, this is about Buddhism, but when we went to Bodh Gaya, which is where Buddha was enlightened, there's a temple there, the Mahabodhi Temple, built in the 4th, 5th century. Behind it is the tree where Buddha sat. And it's enclosed, and usually you just see monks and so on going there. But Susan and I were there in December, which is a very busy time for pilgrims there. And we would just hang out. And one day, one of the monks, the whole place is run by Sri Lankan monks, came up to us and said, "Would you like to go sit by the tree?" I'm like, "Sure, yeah, okay." And then every day, we were there about 10 days, every day, one of the monks would come up and go like, "Why don't you go sit by the tree?" So then one day we're sitting by the tree, and one of the monks comes and says, "Why don't you come with me?" And he took us into the temple, which is not that big, but there's a kind of stairway that's usually blocked off where only monks go. He took us up the stairway into a kind of a smaller temple on the 2nd floor, which is where the monks gather to chant every day. And he said, "I thought you'd like to sit here with us." So then there's like 20 monks and the 2 of us as they're chanting there. We had a very good experience there. We went back about 6 months later, 5, 6 months later. The first thing that happened is, it's a big place. We're walking towards the temple, and 2 monks come out and open their arms and say, "Oh, you came back." So all of those, millions of pilgrims, for some reason, we were singled out. Anyway, so I had, a lot of experience with these kinds of monastic traditions for some reason. I was doing my dissertation on this Hindu monastic group just outside of Jaipur. Spent a lot of time in their monastery. And then in 2006, went to this Jain pilgrimage center and stayed, was in their monastery guest house for 10 weeks as more or less the guest of the abbot. So I was able to, see a lot of daily life because the population there is a town of, in a kind of, if you take everybody within 1 square mile, maybe about 6,000 people. And about half of them were Jain. And so I had a chance to observe and so on.
So tell us,
Well, it's like you have such a richness of experience. I'm fascinated by all the experiences you've had. But go ahead, Paige.
Well, no, I mean, I think, and I just want to just, if you could, Jim, spend a little bit more time. You're kind of heading into the direction that we're wanting to go anyway, but just to speak a little bit more to those concrete experiences, if you could, right, with the leaders. And you said there were some political leaders, there were nuns, and so maybe some of those experiences you had in that 10-week encounter.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So
we're just, and let me say this, maybe just for some context, to continue to sort of mine your experiences so that the students have an opportunity to think about real life Jains.
Yeah.
Right.
And yeah, that's what I want to get to, actually.
Good.
So, well, why don't we talk a little bit about principles, basic Jain principles, and then how those play out in sort of everyday life.
Awesome.
So the number 1 principle, actually, Mahavira established what's generally considered to, by the way, do they know who Mahavira is from the textbook?
No,
okay.
Go for it.
So let me give a little bit of background here. So Jainism is a very a small religion that developed in India about the same time as Buddhism. There are about 4.5 million Jains in India, which is not a lot, and a few hundreds of thousands spread around the rest of the world. Mahavira, the sort of founder of Jainism, was considered to be the 24th in a series of 24 what are called Tirthankars, ford crossers, people who have passed over beyond this world, a prophet of sorts. And so Mahavira is believed to have established the first known organized monastic communities of both men and women, monks and nuns. And then Buddha comes along, does the same thing a couple of decades later. So Mahavira established 5 precepts for monks and nuns. The first 4 for all Jains, right? So for all Jains, well, let's say for monks and nuns, celibacy doesn't apply to householders. But for everybody else, most important principle is nonviolence, ahimsa, absolute nonviolence, which I'll talk about a bit. Truthfulness, non-stealing, not taking what's yours, non-attachment to possessions. And so, for instance, non-attachment to possessions. I was invited with a group of other students out to the home of someone who was in Jaipur, who was known as the Diamond King of Jaipur. He had built himself a literal palace. He had the only giant walk-in refrigerator I've ever seen in India. He had thousands of trees that he'd had planted around his house and so on, and gardens and fountains and so on. And gave us this lavish meal. And so we started talking with him and said, well, you know, aren't Jains supposed to be like, you know, say, not possessive of things? And his response was, yeah, I could just go sleep on the grass right now. I don't care. I got this nice bed, but I don't need it. So in his mind, you know, it doesn't matter if you have wealth around you as long as you don't have that attachment to it. And that's one of the sort of tropes about Jains, because Jains would not take up traditional occupations such as farming, because farming means that digging into the dirt, you might kill worms and living beings and so on. So mostly for the last 2,000 years or so, their business has been business, trading and so on. And so they, particularly in North India, they're all quite well-to-do, quite highly educated for the most part and so on. And so there is a sense of this kind of non-detachment. You find it most clearly expressed beginning, about 2,300 years ago. There was a schism in Jainism between 2 monastic groups. And most Jains today identify as either supporting one group or the other group. One was called the Shvetambar, the white clad, and even today they wear white clothing. They wear masks over their face so that they don't accidentally inhale insects or something and kill something like that. And they carry a peacock feather brush. So when they're walking on a road, they'll brush the road ahead of them to make sure they don't step on anything. The other, called the Digambar, or the sky-clad, have only 2 possessions. They have the peacock feather brush, and then they have this kind of wooden water pot that they use to wash their feet before they go into a temple or something like that. No clothes. That's it. Only those two things. And so they walk around naked. In fact, they have to walk around naked because part of their vow is not to use any kind of transportation. So when I was in Shravanbelgola in South India during the rainy season, this group of monks came in who had walked about 1,500 miles to get there. And when they came into town, they came marching into town. They sent out a marching band to lead them into town, and these guys are completely naked, strutting through the streets. You know, but you think about it, if you're saying that even in Christianity, early Christianity, asceticism was an ideal. And if you take asceticism to its logical conclusion, that's what you get, you know, naked monks. They have other restrictions too. For instance, the males can't sit down to eat and can't use utensils. So, and they can't ask for food. Food has to be offered. And so when food is offered, they just stand like this, and people put water or milk or food into their hands. They eat standing up. They can't, because they can't travel on any kind of conveyances, there are no Tigumber monks outside of India because they can't go anywhere. Anyway, so that's non-attachment. Non-stealing, truthfulness is pretty clear. But non-violence doesn't just mean don't go and slug somebody. It means, well, it means don't do any harm to any living thing, plant, animal, whatever. And so how do you live a life like that? I have a quotation from Mahavira. There are sutras that record some of Mahavira's sayings. One of his sayings is, all souls are alike and potentially divine. None is superior or inferior. All living beings long to live. No one wants to die. Having well considered it, having well looked at it, I say all beings, those with 2, 3, 4 senses, those with 5 senses, and the rest of creation, experience individually pleasure or displeasure, pain, great terror, and unhappiness. So the fundamental idea that Jains really hold fast to is any kind of violence is going to create negative karma for you. They believe strongly in karma and reincarnation. And so if you want a good reincarnation, you have to avoid all violence. That means that they're strictly vegetarian, probably the first vegetarian community in history. And that means that they don't kill insects. They go out of they don't use leather. They don't do anything like that. Jains traditionally will not eat after dark because until the invention of electricity, if you ate after dark, you would have a candle and the candle would attract insects and the insects would die and you'd be responsible for that. But they still largely avoid eating after it's gotten dark. And sometimes it requires a real self-awareness. In walking around with Jains, and I know mostly they're very mindful of where they're stepping, right? And to be mindful of where you're stepping means you have to be conscious of every step you take, every move you make. It's very difficult. And it's not something like, oh, this is what I ought to do. It's internalized. Just as Jews and Muslims internalize, they don't say, oh, I don't like pork, I can't eat pork. No, eating pork is disgusting. And so I was with this group of Jains in Delhi that summer that I was there, and there was monsoon rain. Suddenly just came pouring down rain. And about 20 minutes later, the whole lawn, the sidewalks, everything was covered with millions and millions of little frogs, little tiny frogs. Now the problem was we were on a campus. We had to go from one building to another. And the Jains I was with were freaking out, right? It's like, no, I can't, how can I do it? And trying to maneuver between all these, frogs that were there. So nonviolence is deeply ingrained. And the thing is, as far as vegetarianism goes, vegetables have souls too. Animals have souls, vegetables have souls. What doesn't have souls? Rocks. So if being 100% nonviolent means not killing a living thing, not harming a living thing, it's impossible to achieve. Impossible to achieve. So they do, or what the way they deal with that issue is they classify life forms by number of senses. So it's really, really bad to kill a 5-sensed being, wow. People, animals, and so on. Now there's 4-sense beings and so on and so on. A carrot is a 1-sensed being. It only has 1 sense, which is touch.
But chemicals though. So if there's toxin in the soil or a rock or whatever, I guess that would be touch. It grows around the rock.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, it grows around the rock, or actually the Russians and others have done studies that show that plants have feelings.
Yes.
And what about photosensitivity? You know how plants lean towards the light?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So the gist is that it's impossible the world of humans is a violent place. It's impossible to live without committing any violence at all. So all you can do is attenuate that violence by eating the simplest life forms. Carrots, rice, grain, those kinds of things, particularly grains, because you're not killing the plant to do it, you're harvesting the fruit, right? And those kinds of things. But for instance, a number of Jains will not eat potatoes because if you cut off a piece of a potato and plant it, it's going to grow, and that means it's too much life you're killing.
Yeah.
Same with garlic or onions. They won't eat those either. A lot of them won't eat figs because you open up a fig and there's like 10,000 seeds in a fig. That's all potential life that can turn into millions of figs. And so at the same time, I've been to banquets where they had, 80 different dishes, and they were all delicious and they were all tasty, but they were all vegetarian. So that's the problem for Jains, and what makes them, I think, puts them on the world map of world religions, right? Which is that idea of vegetarianism, which is later on in the 1st century and on, certain Hindu groups pick up on vegetarianism, and nonviolence. Gandhi popularized this idea of nonviolence because Gandhi grew up in a part of India where there were large Jain communities, and he took those ideas and sort of promoted them as Hindu ideas, but they were Jain ideas.
It's fascinating. The moral discernment, like imagine, I love how you said you have to be so aware where your feet place and the air around you and what you put in your body and how
right.
So this moral discernment, that's a lot of what the ethics course is about, is how do you decide right and wrong? How do you live your life towards a good end? So that's a constant, you know,
well, in that sense, you know, James, you know, would argue that, you know, deforestation is violence against life forms, and you know, deforestation and the climate change and so on that impacts even plants is morally wrong. So in terms of that kind of ethical system, they do that.
Oh yeah. Are there any Jains that are like at the forefront of climate change, or even like Black Lives Matters? Or I know Dr. Rawson and I, we've chatted with lots of different people about different world religions, and you made it very contemporary right from the beginning, talking about how you eat, how you interact, and business ethics. And but would our students know any Jains that are kind of at the forefront of some of these social justice movements against violence?
Today, no. I mean, Gandhi is the most famous, but he was a Hindu. There are, you know, the Jains actually going back quite a ways, have set up these kind of shelters for cows and so on, to protect cows, and animal shelters, those kinds of things. That said, what I noticed about Jains is, for instance, in India, there are a lot of stray dogs, some of whom are not particularly healthy, not particularly attractive. They've got mange and so on. People, you know, chase them away. And when I was in this pilgrimage place of Shravana-Belgola, I befriended one of these dogs who began to follow me around everywhere. And, you know, I noticed that, you know, even the Jains would like throw rocks at her and chase her away and so on. And they would say, you know, why are you spending time with that dog, you know? And so in a sense, while, you know, their point of view is, I'm not harming the dog, and so the dog is none of my business. It's not proactive kind of compassion for living things. It's, I don't want to be responsible for harming any living things.
So it's more passive, right? So in thinking about social justice, then it's kind of a different conversation altogether.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, so here's my question too. I mean, just only because I'm thinking about then 4 million Jains in India, and only over 100,000, you said.
150,000 about in the U.S.
In the U.S. So what do you attribute that to then? Why the lack of popularity, right? When you look at Buddhism and Hinduism, and they're just bigger religions, right?
Yeah. Well,
what's happening?
To be a Jain, you have to be born a Jain, more or less.
So no conversion to Jainism, or
there's no conversion. Now that brings up an interesting point, which I'll come back to. Remind me.
Which is important in our conversation, right, with all the world's religions. But go
ahead. So you know, strict vegetarian diet, no leather, no this, no that. You know, not that appealing for some people. And in terms of the monks, right, there's about 10,000 monks left in India, monks and nuns. But even the Jains say, yeah, all the kids, they don't want to be monks, they want to be computer engineers. So that's the thing. So there's no proselytization, but one of the experiences I had when I was on this tour of India is we would go to a number of high schools, Jain high schools, where they were teaching them, you know, normal curriculum, math and English and history and so on, but also teaching them Jain principles. so that they could, and particularly in English, so that they could go out and propagate Jain principles in the broader world. So the Jains aren't interested in getting more followers, but they are interested in having more people put into practice vegetarianism and nonviolence.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one night we went and there was this like 15-year-old kid who gave a 45-minute lecture in English on the virtues of vegetarianism. The other thing that to keep in mind is historically there was a kind of symbiotic relationship between the monks and nuns and the lay people. Monks and nuns are basically generally required to keep moving all the time, not sleep in the same place every night. And so what they traditionally do would be travel around from one community to another, and then people would feed them and put them up, and in return they would give them teachings, oral teachings.
Just like Jesus. Sorry, keep going.
Just like Jesus, yeah. So the problem for Jains in Europe, America, Australia, everywhere is those monks and nuns can't come here because they're not supposed to travel on transportation.
Vessels, yeah.
So how do they get teaching, right? And what's happened is there's one group that's kind of because they're a kind of splinter radical group of Jain. They opened the first Jain university way out in the desert of Western India. I spent a week, 10 days there. And it's basically all nuns who take all the vows of a nun, except they travel.
Yeah.
And most of them have PhDs, speak fluent English, and have PhDs in philosophy.
Wow.
And so those have been coming to the United States and being like visiting assistant professors at Florida International University and other kinds of universities in Canada and the US. Canada. So they're having to adapt to get around that. The other thing I was noticing is the Jains in the US don't really identify themselves now as Shwetambar or Digambar because there's too few of them, and so they build sort of composite temples that are both.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Very cool.
It's so neat how the adaptations and from need but the principles really drive how they live in a contemporary world, and it is tough to hold on to principles. And I think all religious traditions adapt and have to take a look at the modern world and how do you want to interact with it.
Yeah, yeah.
Well said.
That's so neat. I am so grateful. I think you have so many personal stories. So all our listeners in GPS 310, take Dr. Hastings history classes so you can get more great stories of that personal.
You might see me in there. I was going to say within that class.
Well, next semester we're doing Southeast Asia.
Oh, it's happening.
Good. Awesome.
Yeah.
There you go. So if you like this, stay tuned for our conversation with Dr. Hastings' wife.
Well,
that's right.
Who's going to talk a little bit about Buddhism in our next section of world religions and ethics. But we're so grateful that you brought. Now, we're also, do you have any pictures to show us? I think you might have a few.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about, one of the things was about practices, right?
Yes.
So Jains have temples, and every temple is devoted to one or another of these Tirthankars. So there's the Mahavira temple, and there's the Parshvanath temple, and there's this temple, that temple, and some of them have all 24 of them. But the thing about these Tirthankars, the ones who have passed over
Ford crossers,
enlightenment, Ford crossers, is that they no longer exist as individualized beings. And so you can't ask them for anything because there's nobody there to ask. Early Buddhism was kind of the same, right? You can't expect Buddha to do anything for you because he ceased to exist as an individualized being.
Entity, yeah.
So how do they get around that? Well, first of all, in the temples, you know, the form of worship is often honoring these images of the Tirthankars by, you know, basically anointing them with water and so on. The one statue where I studied this, I'll show you this, the statue of Bahubali, 63-foot tall, carved out of a single piece of granite in the 10th century. You see his feet there, so people will, every day there are priests there, but there are no Jain priests, so they actually employ Hindu priests. And anoint their, pilgrims will come and they have to put on these white robes and cover their heads, and then they anoint his feet with sacred substances, water, milk, saffron, other kinds of things. That tall statue, once every 12 years, they build a big superstructure over it, and then they anoint it with 20, 21, 22 sacred substances. I was there once when that was happening and standing a little too close because this water comes and it blows all over, and then milk, and then rice flour, and then flower petals, and then honey.
So you were soaked in liquid, and then you were covered in various, it sounds like
flour and
flowers and powder substances, basically.
So, but I would say they're not technically worshiping them because there's no transactional thing going on.
Right.
They're just honoring them as role models, I guess.
Yeah, an homage.
However, every Jain temple has somewhere on the outside of the temple or the inside of the temple, off to the side somewhere, has what's called a kshetrapal, a protector of the field, a local godling that protects that territory. And so often in some temples, that attracts more attention than the Tirthankar, to whom the...
Because it's a quasi-deity, correct? It's a deity.
Quasi-deity, right. Yeah. So for instance, in this temple next to the monastery in Shravanabelgola in South India, it's devoted to the 22nd Tirthankar, some Tirthankar. You walk in and there's the Tirthankar at the back, and off to the side is a goddess. And, you know, nobody goes to the Tirthankar. What you see happening is women, Jain women and Hindu women, coming to offer saris to the goddess in hopes of getting a good marriage partner.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I've been to another Jain temple out in deserts of Rajasthan called Nakoda Baironji. Baironji is a form of Shiva, the Hindu deity. It's in theory, Parshvanath, one of the 23rd Tirthankar, is the main deity. You go into this huge temple and nobody's paying attention to Parshvanath. There are hundreds of people gathered around Baironji making offerings to him because he can do something for you, because he has power. So I want to show you this picture from there. This is Parshvanath, the Tirthankar, and this is Baironji, the one who really has the power.
Wow.
So yeah, there's a lot of that kind of, you know, just from spending weeks and weeks and weeks observing, people's behavior. That's basically what I do, is participant observation. Sit in the back and just see what people are doing. And so then you start to see these patterns of behavior, right? That this is actually where people are going because the belief is that they can get something out of it.
Powerful.
Wow. Now, if you want to compare, basically, not that different from going to a Catholic church and going to the image of the saints or Mary or somebody over on the side. Jesus is too busy. He can't help you, right?
Mary in intercessions, and you light a candle and you put a donation in, and then you tell Mary, who then tells Jesus. Like it's intercessor.
Yeah. So so it's the same idea, right? That that you need some kind of other go-between,
like a mediator almost, or
a liaison, if you will.
Oh yeah. But an intercessor, the idea that they will apply on your behalf for your benefit. So religious traditions. And when it gets out of hand, that was the Protestant Reformation, saying you can't pay for salvation, that and there's that reaction when it goes too far in the Christian tradition.
Yeah, so it's and that's universal in Hindu temples, in the
Buddhist as well.
What's that?
I would say Buddhist as well, right? I mean, especially when I was living in Singapore. I mean, I remember, right, how many of these sort of elaborate homes with cars were burnt, right, and sent up into the ether.
Well, that's really Taoism. The burning of the stuff for the afterlife, that's Taoism and Confucianism.
Yeah, well, this was what was interesting, is that it was at Buddhist temples, though, Jen. I mean, I'd be curious, right?
because
the syncretism or the
Chinese religion is Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, all wrapped up in a kind of complex.
Which we learned from Edwin, didn't we? Well, but specifically though, right? Speaking about, I mean, maybe sacrifices to or in homage to, but the fact that it's devoted specifically to a goddess rather than the Tatanka, than the Ford Crossers, maybe, or.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking also of I've been a number of times to the Muslim pilgrimage center of Ajmer. And the main shrine there is the shrine of a Sufi saint who died 800 years ago, but is still considered to have the power to perform miracles and so on. So that's the same kind of thing. You find Muslims go there, Hindus go there, Jains go there, Christians go there, I go there. And, when I would be approached by Muslims who say like, oh, where are you from? Oh, America, what are you doing here? And they wouldn't even ask, what are you doing here? They would say, why are you here? And I say, well, I want to see what's going on, blah, blah, blah. And they would say, oh yeah, well, it makes sense that you would want to be here because, who doesn't want miracles?
Yeah. And so it's universal.
Yeah, universal. Yeah.
It's that wanting that intimacy with the infinite, with the other, and that loss of when we're in kind of turmoil in this finite world, the idea of looking elsewhere. And these are the big questions that, with the advent of self-reflection and self-cognition and understanding, you start asking, oh my goodness, where do I belong? Where's my origin? What happens to me after I die? So all of these questions, then the different narratives come together. And I think that's a universal theme through a lot of different religious traditions, is that encounter with the divine.
What I was going to say too is it's interesting to me too, because when I think of Buddhism and I think of Taoism and I think of Jainism, I think of non-theistic religions, but there's still this element that slips in, Jem, as you're talking, that is I mean, they're intimately intertwined in the actual lived practice of these people is the belief in something that is beyond, right? This entity that has a power that is beyond the earthly realm or whatever. So which is fascinating.
So, for instance, you know, in Taiwan, you go to a Taoist temple, and you know, you'll have, it looks like the sort of Ming Dynasty court with all of these various deities and so on. And then, you know, and then there's the kitchen god and the fertility goddess and the matchmaker god and then Confucius. And then somewhere in there, you'll find Buddha. You know, it's all there.
Yeah, it's all there. It's all there.
You gotta hedge your bets, you know, sometimes, you know.
Yeah.
But
everybody's invited to this table.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to offer our students in global perspective on ethics, kind of a perspective of the world that they may not have experienced and they may not have seen within a North American context. That's right. So it's fascinating. We're so grateful that you came and shared, and I can't wait for the Buddhism section. I'm very eager. It's almost like Edwin, you know, Dr. Bagley was teasing us, and then you've teased us some more, and now we're ready for the main event.
Well, the other thing I would point out about Jainism that makes it somewhat unique is they don't believe in a creator. They don't believe in a creator God. They believe that the universe has always existed and will always exist. And so in a sense, we're just kind of moving around in it. You know, the ultimate goal is a kind of nirvana or get out of that cycle of birth and death. And yet it's almost impossible task to do that. So all you can hope to do is do your best in this lifetime and hope you have a better time in the next lifetime. But in a way,
recycled, right?
It's a sort of an existential problem, right? Because you know you're in this, you know, what the Buddhists call samsara, but you can't get out, and there's nobody to help you, right? Because there's no God that's going to do that for you. The Tirthankars can't do that for you. And, you know, similar to Buddha, you know, Buddha just said like, hey, sorry, you're on your own. Don't rely on me. Don't rely on God and so on.
Which also makes your ethical responsibility in this life so eminent, right? So important, right? Yeah. It's not about, I'm going to do this, therefore I'm going to be repaid or I'll be rewarded with XYZ in the next life. It's about here and now. Right, every step even, right? With the peacock feather, every single step.
Yeah.
And that reminds me of our conversation with your friend in Judaism and talking about the now and being kind and being good.
Yeah, absolutely.
So all our listeners and all our viewers, you can see all these intersections between world religions and ethics, how we live in this world. But thank you for taking the time, all this time to be a part of it.
Thank you so much.
Well, that was the short version.
We get the long version in the spring.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe if you want to hang out over a beer for a while,
Yeah. Oh no, I'm in.
I'm in too. All right.